Hi, welcome to another week in our open data course. In this week, we're looking at risk mapping or flood mapping in coastal areas. I'm Julia Kweku, a lecturer at the Department of Geography and Regional Planning in the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. So for this course, we're going to look at coastal floods, and we would also try and understand the vulnerability factors, the relevance of open data in risk or flood mapping, some of the methodologies that are used in risk and flood mapping, as well as some of the tools and technologies. And we are going to also have a look at some case studies, challenges, and conclusions. However, with a case study, I have supplied some documents that you can review, and it is going to summarize everything that we have done in reality or as has been applied in other areas. And so we hope that at the end of this course or this particular week, participants will be equipped with a foundational understanding of what coastal floods are and what coastal flood risk mapping entails. We hope that you also understand why it is necessary and how it is done. What information does coastal risk mapping or flood risk mapping provide? And critically, why the principles of open data are fundamental to its effectiveness and widespread utility in managing coastal hazards. Okay. So by way of introduction, when we talk about coastal floods, most of us are familiar with floods. Floods generally can be described as a condition where water overflows to certain areas which are normally not flooded. And so when we are talking about coastal floods just relate to waters or coastal waters overflowing to certain areas within the coastal zone, which are mostly not prone to flooding. In that case, we can say that flooding has occurred in the coastal area. And so from these two images that I have shown on the screen, we can have a pictorial idea of how dangerous coastal floods can be, how harmful and devastating they can be, and how they often can endanger the safety of persons as well as properties. And as a result of all these negative impacts, the society, economy, and then the natural heritage often suffer as a result of such condition. And so it becomes necessary for coastal floods to be mapped. Coastal floods are simply a category of floods that occur within the coastal areas. There simply can be other types of floods, like the fluvial or the river floods, or we can also have a condition where we have what we call the flash floods, but coastal floods simply limit us to the flooding occurring within the coastal zone. And so what is flood mapping? Flood mapping simply is a process which can be utilized to visualize how far and the characteristics of areas that are potentially threatened by flood. So by flood mapping, one can identify and represent the areas which are likely to be inundated during the flooding condition. And when mapping, in flood mapping, what normally can be considered are a variety of inundation factors. And these may include the marine or oceanic factors, terrestrial factors, and other compounding factors. With the marine factors, we can talk about the conditions which are existing with respect to the ocean. For example, the sea level, maybe the sea temperature, all these pertain to the marine characteristics. And the terrestrial factors, we can talk about what is happening on the land. Here, we look at the condition of the land, whether the vegetation along the coastal area has been removed or it has not been removed, whether people have built or encroached into the coastal zone, which is not supposed to be used for construction, and other things which also pertain to the physical environment. And then when we are looking at the compounding factors, we may look at a couple of processes coming together to cause some of these conditions. For example, there might be kind of encroachment in the coastal zone, and it could be coupled with high or increase in the sea level. And as a result of these issues, the result may be coastal flooding. And so these are some of the factors that can be considered during the coastal flood mapping. Again, with a coastal or a flood hazard map most of the time shows certain aspects and certain element. For example, on a flood hazard map, you can see the extent of the flood when they come. You can also see the depth of the flood, and you can as well see the flow velocity or even the degree of danger that the environment has been subjected to. And so what is flood risk mapping? Whenever we talk about flood risk mapping, we are just looking at the combination of the probability of a flood event as well as the potential negative consequences associated with this. What do we mean by this? These simply are looking at the potential consequences which can come as a result of a flood event which has not occurred. So the potential consequences which can occur if a certain flood happens, all right? And some of these consequences may include danger to human health, danger to the physical environment, the cultural, and then the economic activities. All these may be damaged as a result of a particular flood, which may occur. And so when we're talking about flood risk mapping, we are just looking at a process of assessing and visualizing and communicating this risk. Risk simply means that there is the likelihood. So when we are doing a flood risk mapping, what we are trying to do is to assess the environment and also visualize the potential of things and the potential or the consequences of the effect of whatever flood we are anticipating. And once we are able to visualize these, we have to communicate this risk on a map. And that is what we term at flood risk mapping. And so it simply goes beyond mapping the physical hazard. For example, if you are just looking at an area located very close to the coast, and you are thinking that just because this particular place is close to the ocean, and so it is prone to flooding. It doesn't work like that, all right? So when we are doing flood risk mapping, we are not simply examining the physical conditions of the terrestrial environment or the coastal environment. A lot of other factors come into play, all right? For example, we are looking at those areas and how certain elements within that particular area can be damaged as a result of the potential flood occurring. And so, in trying to understand coastal flood risk, one has to be able to conceptualize that when we are looking at a risk simply talks about the probability of a harmful consequences or the probability of expected losses resulting from a given hazard over a particular time. All right, the consequences or the expected losses, which will come as a result of a particular hazard over a particular time. And so we have to bear in mind that it is just something that we conceptualize, something that we think of, something that we anticipate, okay, that it is possible that this will happen if this happens. All right. And so when we are really talking about the flood risk, we look at the probability of the flood event as well as the potential consequences. So how probable or how likely are the floods going to come? And when they come, what are the potential consequences that can arise as a result of these? And so in flood risk mapping or generally risk mapping, there are three major components which are mostly integrated. So when you are doing flood risk mapping, you just don't look at the physical environment like I have said. You have to consider three main components, and these three components come together to form what we call the triangle risk concept. So in the triangle risk concept, the main components include the hazard, the exposure, as well as the vulnerability. All right, the hazard, the exposure, and then the vulnerability. It simply means that when you want to do flood risk mapping, you are going to consider all these three things together before you can say that indeed you have accomplished mapping a particular flood. All right. And the three elements or the three components will be looking at the hazard, looking at the exposure, and then the vulnerability. So when we are talking about a hazard or when we want to look at the characteristics of a hazard, what does it mean when we are talking about describing a hazard? The hazard simply looks at the nature of the flood event itself. All right. So the particular event which is likely to occur to cause those consequences is what we call or what we term as the hazard. So in this situation, what are we looking at? We are looking at the potential of the flood to occur. The potential of what? The flood. So the flood is what we refer to as the hazard. So in trying to describe or in trying to discuss the hazard simply is looking at the characteristics of the flood event. And these characteristics may include the potential occurrence as well as the intensity. All right, so the potential, how sure are you that it is going to come or it is going to flood? Then someone can say that I'm very or highly sure about that, or I am not so sure. So it is talking about the potential or the probability of occurrence. And some of these things, in fact, these things, looking at considering the other factors, if you're able to consider all these other factors, this can be quantitatively calculated to know the level of certainty at which you are making that statement. Again, when we are looking at the hazard, we can as well talk about the intensity of the hazard. The intensity of a hazard looks at how serious it can be or how dangerous it can be, or the magnitude. All right. And so here we can look at some aspects like the spatial extent, how far did the flood cover the coastal area, or which areas got inundated, how far inland did the flood go. We can also look at the depth of the flood. How deep was the flood? If a person is standing in the flood, how high is the water? So the height of the water is described as the depth. Some people may experience floods which are as high to their knee level. Others may experience floods which are as high as their shoulder level, and so forth and so on. And so these also discuss the intensity of the flood. Then we can also look at the velocity. The velocity is talking about the speed of flow, how quickly the flood came or how quickly the flood waters flowed. Some of the water can be sluggish, others can be very fast. And so the velocity can also give us an idea of the intensity. And then we can also look at the frequency of the flooding from previous hazard maps, right? If certain maps have already been done, or if mapping has already been done, or if there exists some literature on that particular area, literature can be reviewed to know how frequent, how often that particular experiences flood. So that is it about the hazard. The hazard simply describes the event itself. It describes the event itself. And in this case, we are talking about the coastal flood. So the coastal flood here is the hazard which will be described in terms of its extent, in terms of its depth, in terms of its velocity, or even in terms of the frequency of its occurrence. The second component in a flood risk map, which is considered, is what we call the exposure. The exposure. The exposure just talks about the element at risk within the hazard zone. And so for a particular coastal area, which is prone to coastal flooding, what are the things within this particular area which can be destroyed or which can be damaged? And so these may include both people and property. Human lives can be destroyed because maybe people are staying within the area, or infrastructure can be destroyed if there are bridges, if there are roads. These may also be affected if the floods come, or people may have farmland around those areas, which can also be affected during the flood. So exposure simply looks at the element which are lying within the particular zone which is at risk or which is being considered. And these things may be natural resources, they may be economic resources or economic activities, or they even may be the cultural heritage. In the coastal areas in Ghana, for example, we have what we call the sacred groves. The sacred groves. These sacred groves mostly are found within the coastal area, and it is a traditional something which is kept for tradition. Those who are affiliated to the traditional religion, right? So it forms part of the cultural heritage of people. And so if this particular sacred grove is lying within the area which is prone to flooding, then we can also say that the sacred grove is exposed, all right? The sacred grove is exposed because it is lying in the zone at risk. And so exposure simply looks at all the human or the non-human, natural, economic, and then the cultural elements which are lying within a particular area prone to a hazard event. And then the third component that we can also look at is what we call the vulnerability. the vulnerability. The vulnerability is just looking at how susceptible the element of risk are to harm or to potential harm. So if there are people staying within the zone, right, how susceptible can they be affected, or how susceptible are they to being harmed or being affected? All right, so vulnerability can act in terms of physical, economic, social, or even ecological. All right, so physical vulnerability simply looks at all the physical elements which are prone or which could be damaged during the flood. So, for example, if there are buildings within the zone, okay, or the flood-prone zone, the building within the zone here simply means that the building is exposed. So, if you are mentioning elements at risk, we mentioned that buildings are found there. So, buildings are exposed, all right? But if we are also looking at the vulnerability. The vulnerability here, we are just looking at the potential harm or damage that can be caused. All right. So the physical vulnerability, what is the building type? What is the building type? What makes this particular building more susceptible to harm than the other? So we may have two types of buildings, one with cement and then one built with, say, bamboo, okay? So if we are looking at a bamboo building and we are looking at a cement or block building, you realize that these two building types are made up of different materials, and automatically their level of resistance is also going to be different. All right. And so when we are looking at vulnerability, the vulnerability are just the characteristics of the elements at risk, all right, which may make them more susceptible to harm or less susceptible to harm. All right. So in terms of the physical vulnerability, like I was saying, you are looking at physical structures. So there are buildings, there are people, there are bridges and all that. Then we can also talk about even social vulnerability. For social vulnerability, we are looking at the things or social amenities, all right, which are going to be susceptible to harm. So social amenities like hospitals, all right, or the police station or the fire service station. If all these elements are within the area, all right, then we can now assess their level of vulnerability. So their level of vulnerability, they may be vulnerable or highly vulnerable, or they may be less vulnerable. And then the ecological or the natural, we are looking at natural resources within the particular area. Right? Natural resources here. You know, along the coastal zone, some places may have these sacred groves, some places may have the mangroves, and you know the relevance of mangroves. Some places may have certain biodiversity like the sea turtle and all those things. And so if we are considering the susceptibility of the element at risk or the exposed element at risk, we can talk about the ecological. And ecological, we are looking at only the ecological factors within this zone which are at risk. All right. And so when we are looking at the coastal flood vulnerability factors, all right, the vulnerability is a very critical component of the flood risk. It is very, very critical, right? Because it is able to reflect the inherent characteristics of an area or a community that make it more susceptible to harm or less susceptible to harm. And so we can have certain coastal communities exhibiting higher levels of vulnerability, all right, and certain areas exhibiting lower levels of vulnerability. For example, in a coastal area where most of the people, or about 90% of the people, are fishers, if flooding occurs, all right, what will happen to these people? If flooding occurs, what will happen to these people? We are looking at a community where about 90% of the people, residents in the community, depend on the sea for their livelihood, all right? So during the flood, it simply means that their livelihood is going to be affected. And once their livelihood is affected, it means that their standard of living is also going to be affected. Their cost of living is also going to be affected. And so in this situation, we are looking at a community which has a very high level of vulnerability because of its relationship with the environment. We can also look at another environment where about 90% of the people don't have anything to do with the ocean, all right? But you realize that within that particular area, there are a lot of economic activities. For example, there may be a harbor, all right? Or there may be, how do we call it? A bridge, all right? Or some form of tourism, or a whole lot of things. Well, indirectly, all these have a bearing or have a relationship with the ocean, all right? But then the point is that it is not just about the things which can be found, but the kind of activities which are being done there, all right? So where we have people having an intense dependence on the physical environment, we can say that the vulnerability is higher. But where people are not so much concentrated within that zone, and so have a very lower level of relationship with that environment, then we can talk about the vulnerability being lower. And so if we want to talk about factors that contribute to coastal flood vulnerability, we may look at the physical characteristics, such as the slope, such as the elevation, such as the distance to the coastline, and even the presence or absence of alluvial fans and all those things. So a particular area, why is it that a particular coastal area, certain communities get flooded always, and then other communities do not get flooded? And one particular factor that might contribute to this difference in two communities within the same coastal zone might either be the topography or the geomorphic characteristics of the slope elevation, or even the distance to the coast line. Sorry. All right. And so again, we can look at socio-economic factors as contributing to coastal flood vulnerability. Socio-economic factors, we are looking at characteristics of the population in terms of their status, in terms of their age, in terms of even the population density itself. Again, we can also look at their source of livelihood. So in a particular community where we have high population density, you know that automatically they might be, or they will be vulnerable than a community where the population density is low. It means that very few people can be found in a particular area for the low population density. And with a high population density, a lot of people can be found in a small area. And so socioeconomic characteristics can also contribute to different levels of vulnerability. Okay. So we can also now have a look at the relevance of open data for effective risk or flood mapping. And open data has been tipped, all right? And that is why we are even having a course on open data for flood risk mapping. It is very, very important, and it is a very effective source of data for effective flood mapping or risk mapping. Why? Because Open data simply means the data is open. So the data is very much available and the data is also accessible. And so with a very important thing or a very important work like flood mapping, all right, one really requires much available data to be able to capture all these. And the advantage of open data being very open places it at a very higher advantage over some of the other. Again, open data may also come with some free available maps as well as underlying data set. And these are possible because of the terms or the principles of open data. Most open data operates on principles of transparency, collaboration, and accessibility, right? So once we are utilizing open data, we may benefit from other data sets which will help to complement whatever we are doing. Again, most of the open data also ensures that crucial information such as coastal flood maps, as well as statistics, are fully available in order to overcome the potential of operational and economic limitations. And so there are a whole lot of other things which are added, right? They are very much added so that some of these operational and economic limitations might be overcome. Again, it also allows the creation of free access platform. All right. Once we are looking at open data, we also have a lot of other developers who are also coming up with open technologies or open platform for analyzing these data. So it makes them their utilization much more easier. And again, when mapping is based on quantitative data using open data, it can provide a direct and a fully transparent connection between the map and then the information which it is based on. So transparency again is at play, and there are a lot of methodologies which build on open data, and so it makes their application much more easier and replicable than others. Okay. And so in flood risk mapping, like we have already said, there is the need for us to understand that whenever we are talking about flood risk mapping falls under risk mapping, right? And so if we are looking at flood risk mapping, we have to understand and also have the ability of visualizing the potential harm in the coastal areas and all the other things which come into play. And so we look at a function of these three components or elements of risk that we have spoken about, to the hazard, the vulnerability, and then the exposure. All these should be conceptualized and understood when trying to do flood mapping. Okay, so let's quickly have a look at flood hazard mapping methodologies, right? Once we have spoken about the flood hazard, the hazard, like we have seen, looks at the potential occurrence and then the intensity of a flood event when it should come. And primary coastal hazards may involve sea level rise, storm surge, wave action, and tidal ranges. And so when we are looking at these primary coastal hazards, what are some of the methodologies we can use in analyzing it? And here you can talk about statistical models, you can talk about utilizing numerical simulations, integrated hazard risk mapping, which can combine approaches. And you can also utilize the multi-criteria decision analysis. And these may come with output, which may show flood extent, flood depth velocity, as well as the probability of different scenarios. And if we are looking at the flood exposure, we can also consider certain mapping methodologies for flood exposure. Exposure, like we have already said, is just the presence of people and infrastructure or property within the flood prone zone, all right? And so in mapping exposure, we mostly will identify and spatially represent these elements, including the population, the building, the route, and all the other things, all right? So in exposure, you only would try to come up with a map of that particular area and show where all these elements can be located. And you realize that some elements are closer to the hazard, others are far away from the hazard. So we have a pictorial idea of the location of the spatial location of some of these elements that we are talking about. Most of the time, for in terms of mapping the flood exposure, methodologies which are mostly utilized is just the use of the GIS, right, to define areas and then overlay the data layer. So the data layers, we can look at that of just population. We can also look at just the infrastructure, and then that's just that for economic activities. So all these separate data layers would have to be overlaid, and we have a look, or we have an idea of where they are found within that particular area. Then if we are looking at the vulnerability assessment and then mapping, we are only trying to look at how susceptible the exposed elements are to harmful flood impact. All right. And so vulnerability tries to utilize methodologies such as the vulnerability index systems, the vulnerability curves, disaster loss method, vulnerability, the multi-criteria decision analysis. All right. And when we are looking at vulnerability, we have to understand that vulnerability is multi-dimensional because when we were looking at the element at risk or exposure, all right, we realized that we spoke about either having human beings, as in people, or having animals, or even vegetation, all right, that is the environment or ecology. And you can also look at the social things within the society, which are also at risk, as well as the economic activities of people, right? And so when conceptualizing vulnerability, one should understand that vulnerability is multi-dimensional. And so when analyzing it, we also have to use a multi-dimensional approach to characterize the physical characteristics, the socioeconomic characteristics, as well as the adaptive capacity of the element at risk. All right. And so when we are looking at flood risk mapping simply tries to combine all these three elements, all right? So by combining the output of the hazard map, the output of the exposure map, and then the output of the vulnerability assessment, one can see that flood risk mapping has been done. And we are able to do this typically through overlaying of the maps, because it's expected that the vulnerability assessment may come up with maps, exposure will come up with maps, hazard will also come up with maps. And so when we overlay all these things, we are able to have the flood risk really mapped for a particular area. And when we want to do the combination of these three elements, we can, like I have said, use the overlay approach in GIS, or use the multi-criteria decision method, like the AHP, to weigh the contribution of hazard, exposure, and then vulnerability layers, so that you can assign them the different weights which you will consider to making the map, right? And we can also look at the emerging technologies like that of the machine learning, as well as the deep learning. All these are emerging methodologies which can be utilized for the flood risk combination, like combining the elements that we have discussed, the three major elements. All right. And so with tools and technologies used in coastal flood hazard mapping, we can basically talk about the fact that the data collection, modeling, analyzing, and then communicating findings are very complex processes. And so because these processes, each of these processes is unique, a range of different tools and technologies are employed for all these different stages that we talk about. So in terms of data collection and spatial data generation, you can either use the Google Earth or you can utilize socioeconomic census data or government report. And then in terms of the modeling and then the simulation techniques or looking at the flood behavior, one can utilize statistical models, numerical simulation models like the Fortran or the multi-criteria decision making. And then another person can also utilize the Bayesian belief networks. And in terms of the software and spatial analysis tools for processing and analysis, one can also consider the GIS softwares like the ArcGIS and then the QGIS. And in these, you are able to perform some spatial analysis and then the network analysis. And again, in terms of visualizing and communicating whatever results you have, we can utilize vulnerability and hazard maps, graphic semiology, online interactive maps, as well as videos and photos. All right. So what are some of the challenges in coastal flood risk mapping? And basically, the challenges are those that we also know, like data limitations as well as uncertainty, the complexity in modeling. For example, when you have drivers, the complex compounding characteristics like effect of rain, river, storm, and all these things coming together to produce a particular flood, it makes the modeling a bit complex. And we can also look at the methodological inconsistencies and limitations, all right, where there has not been a universally accepted way of doing certain things, but everybody is doing what he or she thinks is unique to him or unique to the environment. So we have these methodological inconsistencies as well as some of the visualization, validation, and then the communication. And so in conclusion, we say that coastal flooding is very dangerous and it makes it's necessary to increase knowledge and correctly assess flood areas for management. And when we are performing or mapping flood risk areas, we combine three major components, and these are what we call the hazard triangle. That is the hazard, the exposure, and then the vulnerability. And again, existing maps can also help map coastal hazards, the damage and the risk areas, and results can be verified against historical events. Then when we are looking at methods of combining some of these things, multi-drivers, land characteristics are essential to identify more vulnerable areas than single driver models. So like I was saying, if you're just going to consider just the one aspect of the physical characteristics to say that just because an area or a community is close to the coastal area or not, it is prone or it is not prone. What we're saying here is that you have to utilize a lot more other variables or drivers than a single one. And flood risk map development is very critical for mitigation activities and support risk assessment and management. In that case, we say that thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the class. Thank you.